Hello and welcome back to War Tech Talk, Eastern Circle's podcast on military technology, innovation, its battlefield application in Ukraine, and geopolitical impact. I'm Anastasia Shapashkina, president of Eastern Circle's think tank in Paris. Today we'll continue with the second episode of Season 2 of our podcast, with a dive into Ukraine's internal politics and alliances, because we believe that both of these factors determine Ukraine's capacity to fight. And today I'm joined by Bogdan Kostyuk, the analyst of Eastern Circles.
Thank you very much for having me.
We'll open with the next turn of the internal political drama of last week, with the revised law of the anti-corruption institutions. We'll continue with the analysis of the financial consequences the anti-corruption law brought upon Ukraine, based on the reaction of the international partners. And we'll conclude with the defense tech section, where we'll comment Russia's bombing of Ukraine cities with jet engine-powered Shahed drones and the counter-drone technology that can answer it. More on that in our DevTech focused deep dive next week. So let's get started. We'll start with the analysis of what happened last week, where we left off at our last episode, when the government of Ukraine introduced a controversial law, and the president introduced the controversial law passed by the parliament almost immediately and immediately signed by the president, all in the same day.
Yeah, it's actually a law that put the anti-corruption bodies of Ukraine, newly created almost 10 years ago. So actually it's a law that limit the newly created independent anti-corruption bodies of Ukraine, National Anti-Corruption Bureau and Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor Office, SAPO. It put it independence of the Prosecutor General, and it's actually caused a lot of demonstrations in Ukraine, in a lot of cities, Kyiv, Lviv, Odessa, Dnipro, and it was actually massively criticized by the Ukrainian, European and American partners.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the European Commission went out and announced that there are going to be consequences if this law is not rolled back. The IMF spoke, G7 spoke, and there was a press conference with several Ukrainian government officials, even special services representatives, with the G7 leaders. And as a result, we see this week the reversal, so to say. They stayed there to work overtime and over budget to actually pass the new law, which we have seen passed today, Law 13533, which basically changes, gets back the lost independence to NABU, the Anti-Corruption Bureau, and SAPO, the Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, but then that meant to quell all of these different fears about their loss of their independence. And last week we discussed about the previous law, and this week maybe what we want to do is to explain to people what is this NABU and SAPO, what are they about?
Yeah, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau is actually an agency which was created on demand of European Union, and it was created in 2015, and it's supposed to be a government body which is handling the top corruption, investigates the top corruption, the special anti-corruption prosecutor office.
It oversees NABU and its activities.
Exactly.
And SAPO, as in prosecutor's office, it had within itself, it was composed of prosecutors. However, it was conceived independently from the prosecutor general's office, right?
Actually, the creation of these special anti-corruption bodies was the precondition for the European Union to continue to fund Ukraine and help and support the war effort.
It was Back in 2015, yes, there was already a war going on. So the Russians have already occupied the Crimea and the east of Ukraine. However, the creation of these institutions also served to continue with the association and eventually European accession process. Before we get into the impact and the reaction of the foreign partners, I'd like to just maybe turn a little bit to this kind of attempted rollback of the law from last week, the law 13533, which basically said that, yes, we're going to restore the independence of NABU and SAPO, but getting to the special anti-corruption prosecutor's office, there are some limitations to what the independence that it restores. To understand these limitations, we have spoken with a Ukrainian leading think tank working on these issues, the Center for Political and Legal Reform. And we have spoken with the analyst Olha Piskunova and the head of the International Relations and European Integration, Victoria Melnik, about this. And what we have understood today when we exchanged with them, they really follow very closely all of these reforms, was that in any case, the new law, 13533, while restoring the independence of the institutions, it does increase the influence of the risk of the influence of the General Prosecutor's Office over this special anti-corruption prosecutor's office.
Yeah, and it's actually the other distinct feature of this law is that the President Zelensky, this law gave him the opportunity to save face, because during this week we've heard a lot about the Russian influence on the National Anti-Corruption Bureau personnel. So this new law introduces the requirement of passing the polygraph test in order to avoid possible Russian influence.
And it's going to be happening every few months now.
Exactly.
For all of the NABU and SAPO employees. And we want to maybe just conclude this little kind of discourse into the NABU and SAPO explanation of what they're doing with just a few illustrations of their work. So just for example, to say that SAPO, the Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, and their cooperation with High Anti-Corruption Court has resulted in charges of maybe over 1,000 individuals, including former ministers, judges, and members of parliament, and basically that's the result, and that's the importance that they represent, and that's exactly what explains why so many people went out the streets last week as well, spontaneously, because this possibility to see over 1,000 high-ranking officials charged really represents that desire of the people for the accountability, which is extremely important, especially within their own Ukrainian government.
Yeah, you're right, because there are a lot of people in Ukraine, they are saying that the result of the SAPO and NABU, that this anti-corruption government body, they are not effective, and they are asking where these all high top Ukrainian officials, why they are not in jail, exactly. But the point is that it's not NABU and SAPO which brings people.
They do not have the power to put them to jail. They have the power to investigate and to charge them with the crime of corruption, but they do not have the power to put them to jail. And maybe with that, we're going to turn to the actual fallout from this dramatic decision last week. After Trump won the US elections, there was a lot of talk in Europe about the upcoming change in funding for Ukraine. In particular, about the need for the EU to replace the US in providing financial and military assistance to Ukraine. The expectation was that Donald Trump will stop all U.S. assistance, and Trump has lived up to this expectation, indeed, which means that if Ukraine wants to continue fighting, it has to rely on the EU for money. And the funding gap EU had to close equals to about 20 billion euros a year to cover especially the budget expenses of Ukraine, so education, healthcare, and salaries for the government employees, payouts, social payments. Since the start of the war, Ukraine received about $139 billion of financial aid, 48 of which came from the EU and went toward the Ukrainian budget.
There are two main sources of the Western funding for Ukrainian budget this year. The first one is ERA, Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration, led by G7 and IMF. Ukraine was scheduled to receive 17.2 billion euros in the framework of ERA. It's mostly the interest rates from the frozen Russian assets. The second way of funding is the Ukraine facility. This is actually the mechanism money for reforms.
Within the accession to the European Union?
Yes. And Ukraine was scheduled to receive 12.5 billion euros according to the program
by the end of the year.
By the end of the year, and received only 3.7. So it brings us to 18 billion euros still to be paid out.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and this is the money that the European Commission said it is putting on hold in response to last week's developments. And this is especially important today because Ukraine faces 35 billion budget deficit this year. And even if the 18 billion euros are paid out by the European Union, it would still have to scramble where to find 17 further billion euros to close the budget gap if the EU continues to support as it does right now. And of course, this puts the events of last week in perspective because it explains us why they are so important, because it's not just closing the budget gap for Ukraine today is not just the point of keeping hryvnia on afloat, or it's not just the point of supporting the economy. It is really a survival point, because if there is no more money to pay the pensions, to pay the soldiers, to pay the veterans, then of course the war effort is unsustainable then. And so since Ukraine fully depends on foreign funding, the moment that the foreign partners stop trusting Ukrainian government is really a fateful moment. It is definitely about trust, because Ukraine has been trying in this last maybe 2 years to reposition itself from a receiver of money to a partner. What you have taken up as a partner, you're not just having rights, you're having obligations.
Yeah, I agree with you, because even if we look at this Ukrainian facility, this is an agreement and this is a benchmark Ukraine by itself agreed on.
Exactly. And under the Ukraine facility, the European Commission already cut the payout by 1.5 billion euros. The decision to pay out 3 billion out of 4.5 billion scheduled to be paid out to Ukraine in the summer was the decision based on Ukraine's unfulfilling the reforms it had subscribed to fulfill in the first quarter of this year. And these reforms were related notably to 3 issues: appointing more judges to the High Anti-Corruption Court, enacting a new reform on the Agency of Asset Recovery Management, and also passing the decentralization legislation, or continuing to pass this legislation relating to the relationship between the executive branch and the local governments.
I've heard that the situation with the Asset Recovery Management Agency, or so-called ARMA, but it's about the bureaucracy.
The bill enacting the reform of the agency was passed by the parliament, or rather, and had to be signed by the president 2 weeks after the passage. What happened was Zelensky prolonged the signature by 2 more weeks, and more than a month later, the European Union said, enough, we're not going to wait any longer. And hey, what a contrast with the law
on Nabu and Sapol.
Yes, last week, which was signed immediately. Right?
What can I say? Priorities. And I think when we are talking about the consequences of the last week vote in the Ukrainian parliament, we are missing out the point of the desacralization of President Zelensky, because I think at the beginning of the war, of the full-scale invasion here in the European Union, in the United States, and in Western countries, he was idle. He was a guy who stood up to the overwhelming Russian war machine. But now, reading all the critical articles from the Financial Times, from The Economist, which were covering these wars, it's just, for me, I feel like it's some kind of the desacralization of his image in the West.
Desacralization, because there is an impression that at the moment that all eyes should be on the war, the focus may be shifting toward internal politics.
Yeah, and this is at the moment when, for example, last night Kyiv was under another massive attack, and it was unusual because it was the first time when Kyiv was bombed by the Shahed drones equipped with the jet engines.
So flying at 500 kilometers an hour.
Yes, and it's really hard to intercept them.
Yeah, basically the only interception method are the rockets, very expensive rockets.
Our sources from the Ukrainian defense industry are telling us that several counter-Shahed drone solutions are in development right now. So I think that Russians is working very systematically. Recently, CNN reported that according to the new satellite images, Russians expanding their drone factory in Elabaga in Tatarstan. This is the region of Russia. And the statistics are very kind of impressive, because during this June 2025, Russians launched 5,500 Shahed drones on Ukraine. Only 1 year ago, in June 2024, it was 16 times less.
And this is possible because of this systemic approach. The capacity of that factory in Elabaga is estimated by the satellite images by CNN to be 40,000 people.
Yes.
Who could work there potentially,
yes.
Who will be working there once it reaches full capacity, which is absolutely mind-boggling how much they can produce if they work 3 shifts a day and 24 hours a day, basically cycles. With that, we have to conclude that yes, Ukraine does have, according to our sources, developing several solutions for intercepting these drones, not with rockets, but with counter-drone systems. However, this remain, as of today, small, medium enterprises. They're lacking funds, and this is something that only European and Western investors and Western partners can address. Thank you, and we're going to see you next week with a continuation of War Tech Talk. This episode of War Tech Talk was prepared by Bogdan Kostyuk and Anastasia Shabachkina. Editing and production by Edica Gadeva.